Welcome to Ground Truth. Join Sam Faddis as he looks for truth from those on the ground, in the middle of the action with key insights regarding critical national and international issues. Listen for discussions and interviews on national security, terrorism, politics, espionage, the paranormal, and weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis, and this is WKCV 103.5 FM, the voice of Keystone College in beautiful La Plume, Pennsylvania, where amazingly we are still enjoying Indian summer and great fall foliage. Having started the show on that positive note, what we're going to talk about today is going to be something that's a little heavy. We're going to talk about school shootings, and what we're really talking about is security and how we prevent school shootings and stop people from getting killed. And I'll say up front for myself, and I know the guest that I'm going to intro in a minute is in the same place philosophically, it's horrifying that at this point in our history we even have to have this conversation, that we're talking about a reality where kids are being shot in schools. Says something I think pretty dark. What has changed is not the availability of firearms. Something has changed in society, and we really ought to look in the mirror and think about what that is. But that's a topic for another day with another guest. The gentleman we're going to talk to today, Michael Bruecks, has a company called Black Site International. There are 1 million people in the world these days who claim they're involved in security. And then there's a handful of guys with credentials like this gentleman has, because his background really comes out of security for nuclear power plants, and he has run programs on a massive scale with hundreds, if not thousands of people, state-of-the-art gear, stakes could not be higher, and you better put together a program that has to work 24/7, 365 days a year, because there are no days off, and you have no idea when it's going to be for real, and everything's on the line. So at this point in his life, Mr. Bruecks and his company, Black Site International, have taken that expertise and are applying it now to this area of school shootings and trying to help schools figure out a real way to deal with this that works and will prevent horrifying incidents from occurring in the future. We're going to dig into that in some depth. So, Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about this very important, difficult topic for most.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you hitting that note as well. We're going to talk about techniques and security and all that kind of stuff, and it's all important, incredibly important, because we're talking about the safety of our kids. There's nothing cool about it. There's nothing cool about getting ready to deal with a school shooting. Again, it's a terrible subject. But you're down in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I know that you have gotten over the last few years heavily involved in working with school districts down there. Can you give us an idea of what you're doing and sort of the state of play? In other words, what are you doing and what are you seeing?
Sure, absolutely. So, interestingly enough, I had Black Site International, my company, had never really been involved or even considered school security to be one of those sectors that we would be involved with. And it was just after one of the more recent shootings a couple of years ago, I happen to know a school board member, and I have 5 children. And each of those children attend this one school district. And one of the school board members had stopped me and asked me, knowing some of my background, if I'd be willing to help out with school security improvements, because as a school board, they were interested in doing things and starting to address school security more so than they ever had in the past. So interestingly, this all started as sort of a pro bono voluntary opportunity for me to be involved with the school my children go to, and as a member of the community and knowing the parents, to do something hopefully good to help the schools to take their desire to build a school security program in the direction that it needed to be. And so been doing it, as you mentioned, for about 2 years now. And from that initial school evolved into an actual professional contract. And from that time, multiple other school districts in the area have since solicited my support, and I've now entered into about a half a dozen or so contracts with school districts, with townships that have responsibility for those school districts, busing companies, and private schools. So it's been a real interesting ride, and for me personally, a great opportunity to introduce my knowledge of what a real security program should look like into that school sector. So as you can imagine, Sam, the world of security that you introduced, Black Site being involved in, and of course with your background, they're very high-level, high-end programs to defend against a significant type of threat. And they're based on critical elements and standards to be able to defend against those threats. And the challenge that I saw fairly quick with being involved with school security is that fundamentally then, and I would say fundamentally today, there is still a significant gap with the basics for building effective school security programs. So when, as a community or as a state, as a country, after one of these terrible events occur, you hear the comments, when is this going to stop? What are we doing differently to prevent these types of events? So, of course, we look at that the same way. And the reality, as far as I see it, is that we still have not made a concerted effort and made that real serious attempt to change the program and align it to the standard it needs to be to do the job it needs to do. And so when I say fundamentals, we still don't have a definition of the purpose for a school security program. So when you create a program, and I'll say a high-end or a mature security program, it has to start with certain assumptions and certain elements before you even begin filling in the gaps. And the first thing is to understand what the purpose of that program is. What's the objective? What are you trying to prevent? And then ultimately, how do you know when it's met that goal? And how do you know what good looks like? And that just does not and is not part of the school security programs today. There are many training programs available. There are conferences that take place. But when you look at that standard, it's not defined by a state government. It's not defined by the federal government. In fact, I would say for Pennsylvania has some information that's been available to the school sector, but it's more or less guidance documents. And for what's considered mandatory, it really does not address how that mandatory information stops the bad guy and prevents the events from becoming a bad day.
So, Mike, let me jump in for a second, because I'm tracking with you because, as listeners know, you and I come from different backgrounds, but with some overlap, and I understand what you're talking about and sort of the idea of a design basis threat and determining what the threat is and what you're trying to achieve. But I'm not sure that the average listener is tracking with that, because the average listener, I'm thinking, is saying, what do you mean we don't know what the goal is? The goal is to stop kids from getting shot in the hallway. So break that down for me. When you say they're not telling us what the goal is, what's that mean? I mean, concretely, what's that translate to?
Yes, thanks for that, Sam. So let me just start with saying, I was just at a parents' meeting the other day talking about school security, and you're absolutely right. When I get in front of those groups, their objective is that their children go to school and come home from school safe. People that are teaching at school, they want to go to school and come home safe. So how do we build those programs? What do we have to do to better protect the schools? So when we talk about standards, when we talk about what does good look like, we don't want to have a school shooting. We don't want to have individuals in that school that aren't supposed to be in that school causing harm to students. We don't want to have threats that carry out into actual events. We're trying to stop a violent act from occurring within the school facility or on the school property. We're trying to identify individuals because of their behaviors or statements may be deemed as posing a threat to others and may be planning a targeted attack of violence on the school or an individual. So what we're doing and what we need to have are the objective is to understand that is the threat environment we're looking at and what types of programs are necessary to build and implement.
So what you're saying from a programmatic standpoint, and look, this is what I meant when both of us touched on the issue up front of how horrifying this was, because to make clear that, we're going to end up here talking in some business jargon, some organizational jargon, like, from a programmatic viewpoint, as I just said. That's not meant to take away from the fact that this is horrible. But if you're going to implement it across schools, across large organizations, and it's going to work every day, all day, it's got to be more than an aspiration. Our kids come home safe. You got to boil that down exactly as you're saying to, all right, then what exactly is the requirement for every school? And get this down to where this is defined and mandatory, and concretely what's that translate into in regard to doors, access, security, procedures when there is a shooting. That's what we're talking about, right?
That's absolutely correct. Exactly to your point. The most basic of expectations is, number one, that when you approach a school, you want to know that every one of those perimeter doors is closed and locked, preventing what we call unauthorized access. We don't want anybody to be able to just access a school because a door has been left open, they don't have access or authorization. We don't want anybody from the general public to have easy access into the school. So for those school doors, with each school that we've gone to, it's a common problem for school doors, the perimeter on the buildings, to be found open, propped open, pushed open. Somebody knocks on one side of the door and somebody from the inside opens it up. You don't have any control of who's coming into the facility. When you're coming into the main facility, as we all see with many schools today, you see some type of check for people coming in. But we know that for the most part, those checks are really not that challenging and not that restrictive for simply buzzing in and being led into a building and not really going through some type of process to make sure that you're approved, authorized, and necessary and a legitimate person to be inside that school. You really don't want anybody in there that doesn't have a business purpose to be in that school. So that's a fundamental physical security attribute. We also have, for the schools, security cameras. You want to know who's coming on the property. You want to have an ability to assess if something's taken place on the property. So those are some of the items under physical security. And then you have the inside or the internal types of programs, the training programs. And most training programs that we're seeing today that need to be or that are being conducted at the schools don't really meet, in my opinion, a standard for being effective to address the types of threats, and not just the types of threats, but the real world events that have taken place. When you look at the tactics and techniques that school shooters have used in the past to gain access into the schools, and then what the response from those schools was to being aware of an active shooter in the school, it's unfortunately led to more people being harmed, injured, killed than what was necessary, or not necessary, but what could have been prevented. And we made it too easy for that shooter to be able to accomplish that mission because we just didn't do fundamental, basic programs for physical security and technologies to keep people out of the school and keep weapons out of the school, prevent those types of events. Those are some of the fundamental areas that we look at and that we're working right now. And the training program is a significant challenge. And I can get into that more if you'd like to talk about what we're seeing there and what we think has to change to become more effective.
Well, let me throw out an observation to you and then get your reaction to this because, again, I don't do work in this area, but I come from, I guess, loosely defined a security kind of background, really from the field of intelligence. But one of the things that strikes me generally, not just about school security, but in the security business in the United States in general these days, is we got a whole boatload of companies that have been created and are run by what I would call shooters. And before anybody gets up in arms, that's not meant to be a disparaging term. I'm talking about people coming out largely out of the special operations community. They're God's gift. They're the best the world has ever seen at what they do. Most of them have spent many years on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if I'm in a gunfight, where I want to be is right behind one of those guys until he has taken care of business, because that's the safest place in the room. But they've moved generally into the world of training folks on security. And when you get into the realm of school security, I'm not at all convinced that people from that background know how to train the folks they're supposed to be training or even what they're supposed to train them in. I mean, the way you train a Marine Special Operations guy, high stress, in his face, is, I think, maybe not the way you train a career kindergarten teacher. And the career kindergarten teacher is not ever going to be a crack shot with a pistol and take care of business. That's not his job when the school shooting happens, in my estimation. His job is to follow the procedures that you keep talking about have to be created and do what he's got to do within that system. Do you see that kind of problem when you're seeing other companies that are out there working in the school security?
Absolutely. And so being around the country and then specifically in the area that I'm currently working, I would define it as three different types of organizations or persons with different backgrounds that are started getting into this training element and, in my opinion, are not necessarily the right answer for what it is that we need to have. First of all, you do have the folks with the military background, as you mentioned. I've worked with them as well long periods of time, and they do have their skill sets for certain applications. You also have former law enforcement or former federal agents that are retiring and getting into this world as well. And they may never have been responsible or had the opportunity to build security protection programs. And of course, they had phenomenal careers doing what they know. But this is a totally different type of animal. And you're going into an educational sector. You're dealing with teachers. You're dealing with children. You're dealing with a group of people that never considered or thought about being in an environment where they would be potentially attacked with a high-powered weapon and what to do in response. And you also have, lastly, and unfortunately I'm seeing this more often than not, you have the internal resources within the school that are being utilized, folks that have backgrounds in facilities, or backgrounds may have touched upon, an educational degree in law enforcement or something like that. And they believe, and this is at the leadership level as well, that they understand security. They don't put the thought or the effort into understanding just how complicated and complex this program needs to be, because we're talking about lives at the end of the day, saving lives. And you really need to have that right person who's actually done this type of work, created the programs, demonstrated the effectiveness of these protection programs in all kinds of real world and or challenging conditions. And red team assessment drills are a key attribute for an effective training program. What we're finding right now is that, I'll give you an example. I was at a school, 2 different school exercises recently, and there's a school training program that's been placed or put out several years ago. And many schools went to that program because they were led to believe that this was a viable option and was an effective tool for attacking the attacker. Accepted that, and they built the programs around that concept. So at these training exercises I've attended as an observer, we're going in as we call ourselves a Red Force. The Red Force, as you know, is a group of people playing the part of the bad guy, the shooter, coming into the school, actually simulating the attack inside the school to see the response and the reaction from the teachers and the students. So we go up to a door to access into the classroom, and the teachers, as soon as we open that door, are throwing literally beach balls, rubber balls, and other objects at us, standing right in front of us. And that's not reality. So the training they received to date, the teachers believe that their main responsibility or best way to survive the event is to attack that attacker. And we know that's not going to be the reality in that type of situation. If somebody's actually gotten access into your room with a high-powered weapon and you're still in that classroom, I don't know that throwing a stapler or any other type of object is going to have the response that you think it's going to have to stop the shooting. But it's those types of tactics and training models that have been created and have been assumed because of people that are claiming a certain type of background, which is believed to be a subject matter expert. Consequently, they're being integrated into the schools, and the training that's being provided is not, in my opinion, I call it negative training. I'd rather see the training focus on immediate awareness of the person inside the building, immediate actions you take, which shouldn't be more than 3 decisions to fortify that classroom or to exit out of that classroom, and not thinking that your best option is to hang out, hide behind concealment, and then to attack the attacker, which is unfortunately, I'm seeing that too often as a standard.
So let's shift gears here for a second, Mike, because, this is another one of those topics that we could talk about for hours. But one thing we haven't touched on at all, so far what we've been focusing on is sort of preventing anybody from getting in the school, and then if somebody does get in the school, the procedures for reacting to that and dealing with that. But what we haven't dealt with, there's a whole nother piece of this puzzle that I know you work on a lot, which is insider threat, which is basically, or a variation of insider threat. So basically identifying that person who's likely to commit this crime and preventing them from committing the crime in the first place, preventing them from being on campus, identifying them. And whenever I read about this or talk about it, I always think about years ago, the Virginia Tech shooting and the guy who ultimately killed so many people there, and how folks were, afterward, you talk to people and half the campus, it seemed, was terrified of that guy. Teachers were terrified to have him in their classroom, and he wrote poems and essays that were so violent and so disturbing that teachers went to school administrators to try to get somebody to do something, and yet absolutely nothing happened. And then the next thing, this guy is slaughtering people on campus. So can you talk to us about that piece of the puzzle? Absolutely.
As you mentioned, for about the last 6 months, we've been creating what's called a threat assessment prevention plan. Now, there are organizations such as the Secret Service, the FBI, national psychologists who have over years put together guidance for schools to use. But as you can imagine, it really never was implemented or recognized or even known about by the schools. So we're at a position right now that we've been researching significantly for these last 6 months. Each one of these documents, they're not identical. So the challenge for us has been to pick and choose what we believe to be really good quality information from each one, and to pull that together to create a perfect document, if you will, for the schools to use. But to your point, Sam, historically and through the data that's been identified after each one of these shootings, it's understood that at least 70-some% of the active shooters identified had made some type of remark to a friend, to a parent, to another individual of their intent to commit that horrible act of targeted violence. And those individuals failed to report that knowledge to somebody that could have done something about it. These individuals has been proven or demonstrated at some point. Now, they will start, I can't say what level. It could be early in their school career, it could be later on. A lot of times, they're victims of bullying, or they just have some type of mental health problem. Over time, it manifests more into where it's a observable behavior. So now there is an opportunity that we now are aware of, that if you are training people within the school, teachers, staff, to be more vigilant in looking for these behaviors, we call them concerning behaviors or prohibited behaviors, and then ultimately a threat. What to do upon observation of those behaviors. So we pulled together and are creating what's called a threat assessment team. This team is a multidisciplinary team of a variety of people that would include mental health counselors, faculty members, coaches, whoever would have contact with those individual students. And they would meet frequently to talk about things that they've seen that may be indicators, because of the behavior, of something that has changed, something that is different. It could be the way a person is demonstrating becoming more isolated from his friend group. They may be talking about or have obsessions with weapons, or having some type of obsession with mass shootings. They're giving off red flags, if you will, that if you're talking to a trained person or that's being heard, they understand that's different, and that's something we need to be taking a look at. The whole objective of these threat assessment teams and this whole plan is to identify these individuals as potential proposing threats down the road, and to put together intervention plans that would target the causes that are ultimately responsible for these individuals wanting to cause some type of harm or violent act on another. So as we know, bullying is one of those common denominators for most of these shooters. And then at some point, doesn't happen all the time, but these individuals get to the point where either they have ideation of suicide, and as we know, the difference between wanting to commit suicide and homicide can be a very thin margin. So that's another key element that we want to look at and understand when we hear those types of comments or those individuals in those situations, that will really making a significant attempt to minimize or eliminate the causes of that person having that type of anger. There's a list of other elements that contribute to that, risk factors that would aggravate the behaviors that would ultimately manifest into a shooter. But yes, that is a key program. It's fairly new. It's my understanding that the state and possibly the federal government are going to be mandating something like this next year. But it is, from what I've seen and how we are working this with the schools, it has the potential to be a very effective tool in the toolbox to start preventing these events early on.
Well, Mike, look, we're about out of time. Like I said before, we could talk about this for hours, but we will have to have you come back on. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this, as we keep saying, really horrifying but incredibly important topic. God knows we got to get this right. We can't keep having our kids gunned down in our schools. Thank you very much for being on with us today. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Ground Truth.